So, can you become more socially mobile if you improve your character? Well, interestingly, this Social Mobility Character and Resilience Manifesto, don't you just love it? In 2012, which hasn't actually become part of the mainstream quite in this form, which is, it highlighted 7 key truths about social mobility. It's like something you read it while you're in the waiting room for the dentist, isn't it? After reviewing evidence across all stages of the life cycle, the report concluded that personal resilience and emotional well-being are the missing link in the chain of social mobility. So again, it goes back to the argument, you only have to think differently and you will be able to become Prime Minister of the UK. And it called on the governments to make character and resilience a focus of the National Careers Service. Where's our Careers Service people here? Encourage staff to participate in CSR activities to develop character and resilience in young people, implement internal training programmes that help develop the character and resilience of staff, like ourselves, etc., etc. And then develop alternate routes into advanced professional positions that reflect the importance of character and resilience rather than raw academic achievements. Well, that's all very well, but what form of character are they actually talking about? It's becoming pervasive in higher education. I don't know who this person is, but they were speaking at the Future of STEM Subjects in Higher Education earlier this year, and he said, character education is a way to level the playing field for those who might otherwise be unfairly held back by class or background. So, what sort of character? David Cameron. We need to take luck out of the equation. I'm not sure that kids who live on a slum estate would consider they were particularly lucky, but there we go. We need to take luck out of the equation. If you do not believe in continued hard work and concentration, if you do not believe that you can return from failure, you will not fulfil your potential. It's what the Tiger Mother's battle hymn is all about. Work, try hard, I know. Believe you can succeed, get up and try again and thump your children in the process, but there we go. Now, for too long, this has been the preserve of the most elite schools. I want to spread this to everyone. So as we reform education further, we'll develop new character modules, teach character virtues like curiosity, honesty, perseverance, service. Service?
You should go up and try it again after you lost the Brexit vote, really, shouldn't it?
Sorry?
You should have got up and tried again after you lost the Brexit vote.
Yes, what a slacker, honestly. Just got a rotten character. So, if you take all of that argument about mindset and about grit and resilience in the ways in which it's been framed and about character and so on, the logical hypothesis is those who attain best academically have the right character and attitude. Those who do badly have character flaws, or they haven't attained the right sort of character yet. And therefore, it's within an individual's gift to attain academic success. So if an individual fails, it's all their fault. That would be the logical hypothesis. And that's why, for example, surely Muslim pupils have the lowest UK attainment. Wrong character and attitude. Only 15.5% of looked after children coming out of public care, get 5 A stars to C compared to 60%. Wrong character and attitude. Only 6% of them get worse, really poor character and attitude. It's why they don't bother going to university. And obviously that must be why 3/4 of white students get a first or a 2-1 compared to 60% of students who are non-white and less than 50% of black students. Just a lack of effort and the wrong sort of character. Of course not, it's ridiculous. It's just nonsensical. Mindset and character discourses avoid any recognition of structural inequality. They can completely position away any argument for the need for external resources. They position wholly on developing internal traits, but in doing that valorise only certain forms of trait and personalities. So my interest then is why, if it's all down to character and attitude, why do some students drop out? If you go for that logical argument that students who have the best sorts of character, grit, determination, positive mindset should never drop out of higher education, and if they're resilient students, they should remain and complete their degrees, and yet we know that that is not the case. So my interest is in looking at those who've shown resilience in getting into higher education, I'm going through sort of data at the moment. I've got to about 74 biographical interviews. I've got more to look at over a range of different projects, some of which have been specifically looking at resilience and some of which have been broader about retention and success. Particular interest in refugees that I've talked about, care leavers, black students from the lowest socioeconomic backgrounds who are very underrepresented in higher education, Muslim students, and then older learners with very complex trajectories into higher education across different aspects before they come in, undergraduate, postgraduate, and so on. And I'm interested in finding out what sorts of internal and external resources are they drawing on, and what are the risks that they're facing that might not enable them to overcome adversity. So those were the sort of, there's an analytical framework that's been developed to actually look at the data. So I wanted to look at the resilience. So this was listening to their stories of the things that had happened to them before they arrived in higher education. Some of that has been quite challenging, quite problematic, particularly listening to refugee stories. Then I've talked to them about what they're facing in terms of risks as they perceive them in higher education, personal resilience. And this isn't being asked of them explicitly, but in their narratives, the sorts of things that they're talking about and the ways in which they're talking. Then the external protective factors they feel able to draw on and they actually draw on. And then looking at what universities are actually doing and what they could be doing to try and enable students to be more resilient. So I'm going to just talk through a couple of students here, and they're exemplars, probably the more extreme exemplars, but they're the more interesting stories. So I've talked about this project before because it's actually a project that's had quite a big impact on me. This was a project working with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in Leeds. So these children had all come into the UK without any form of family support. So they were here as independent children in the care of the local authority. Most of them were around 15, 16 years. Most of them were not in schools because schools are very reluctant to take children who come with little English and who are that age. And almost all of them were not in foster families. They were living in the sorts of centres that you put homeless people into. So they were not being particularly well looked after, even though they were in the care of the local authority. This project was looking at working with young people to develop their understanding of higher education and how they may see going into higher education as a point in their future. And we worked with a range of community artists to do some work with them to develop a handbook of resources, which it's a few years ago now, but went out to the whole of Yorkshire and Humberside for organisations working with refugees and asylum seekers. So these are the young people who are involved in the project. And obviously, we assumed that we would need to keep their identities confidential, so we gave them Play-Doh to develop little models of themselves. They'd never used Play-Doh before, which was absolutely fascinating, because about 4 hours later, when they'd built the whole of the royal family, most of London, and everything else they could think of, we finally got these images. So we photographed them all, and this is at the beginning of the handbook. Then this boy here said, I don't want my model to be on the handbook, I want my photograph to be there. And then he started to talk about his journey to get to Europe, to the UK. And he talked about the fact that as a very young child he'd been looking after goats in the hills above Afghanistan or wherever it was he was from, and he would do that alone at night. He talked about what had happened to his family. He talked about the journey he'd taken, a very, very long, very, very problematic journey to get to the UK, and how he'd actually got into the country, how he'd point where he was actually on the project. And he said, I don't want to be seen as a victim, I want to be seen as a survivor. And he was probably one of the most resilient people that I've ever spoken to. So that's the book, and there he is. He's on the front of it. And he looks quite like his pictures, doesn't he? You can see him there. And it really made me think about how extraordinarily resilient some of these young people are. And that was one of the projects that I was involved in for quite a long time. And yet, when they got into higher education, they couldn't survive quite often, and they would leave early. So how is it that that young person who's gone through all of the things that they've talked about is getting into somewhere that the rest of us would think is a very, very safe environment? struggled, and it's not to do with necessarily academic struggles. There's something else going on. But I wanted to just explain his story and then the one of the next one. I'm going to read this out while you're reading it, just for the benefit of the tape. So this is Rose, who also was a former refugee. So she says, back home in Congo, I first did a teaching course. I've got a diploma in teaching. Then the war broke out. We left everything, turned back into the bush. We were with my sister and my parents. Some people died. When they started bombing like that, you just wake up and start running. That's how I lost my parents. They didn't die, I just lost them. For a year, I didn't know if they were alive or not. After a time, we found ourselves in Zambia, and we lived there for 7 years in that country in a refugee camp. Then I applied for resettlement. I lived in a hostel for 2 months, and then I was given a house. Unfortunately, in the corner, there was too much antisocial behaviour. Honestly, life was not easy. This is in the UK now. I started thinking, I thought that life in the camp was, that there was too much antisocial behaviour, racism, all of that sort of thing. Honestly, back home, we're like united, community is one. Here it's like a closed family. You're just friends with your own family. You don't even know your neighbour, you're not talked to. And because of this confusion, honestly, that was one of the reasons for choosing this criminology course, asking myself like every day how this society works, how people think, why people, because whenever you go, they throw eggs, they tell us go back, you know, those kind of things. They're throwing wood against your house. When I came to college, I started reading what they have, and I said, me, through criminology at least I'd be able to understand how this society functions. So Rose is another person who also dropped out of higher education, and you can see everything that she's been through and all of the circumstances, and yet she still really struggled once she'd got into university, and she didn't complete that course. Another student, so I haven't just worked obviously with refugees, but this student is a white student from a low socioeconomic background, and she's talking here about family have never supported for her, a family wouldn't pay for her mother's funeral, she's been independent, her father died when she was 12. And then she said, I've always had a logical mind, knowing, I can remember thinking from a very, must have been about 6 or something like that, wanting to stay out with my friends, but I was supposed to be in for lunch. Now if I went in, my friends didn't like go home, so I didn't want to go in, stayed out with my friends. I'd get hit, but it would only hurt for 2 or 3 minutes and then I'd be fine. So I always had a logical brain, you know, to make a choice. So I think from a very young age, I remember being able to work out things like that, being able to work out, I know about consequences. If I'd been hit before, I timed how long it hurts, you know, if it's worth the bother, basically. I must have done, because I just knew how long it would hurt. I knew how long that slap would sting, and I just sort of made it up. I'd be in pain for a couple of minutes. I'd stay out with my mates and I just made it up. My brain's always worked like that. Anyway, as to say, there's 74 of these interviews, but what I've been doing is analysing what's actually happening when they get into higher education. There's nothing that you won't expect that's going on here. All of us who work in academia will recognise these pinch points, so induction, submission of first assignment, return after Christmas, retention into and post-placement becomes really problematic, and then progression on in other years. And a lot of these things will be the reasons why all sorts of different students drop out of higher education. But I want to relate that to the concept of resilience. So what personal resilient traits are these students showing? So going back to the list that I talked about earlier, all of these things are here and present. Optimism, creativity, sense of humour, you can hear in that last one, coping strategies, social skills, etc, etc, etc. None of that is lacking in these young people. There are some personal resilient characteristics that are less present. Cohesive life narrative that I talked about, particularly for refugees, when you've had a particular view of how life might go and then you have a sudden dislocation partway through your life, or for other people who've had quite dramatic life circumstances. That does shape how people think about the future, and all of these students actually struggle to see themselves coherently in the future, which is another area of interest of mine. They have a range of coping strategies, but they might not be the strategies that are applicable in higher education, and they're not necessarily have particular adaptability, but that's primarily because they lack resources, whether that's social connections or financial resources and so on. So they can often find it difficult to recover because of these things, but all of this is there. These are not people who lack character, believe me. So then I was looking at the external protective factors that these students have. Some of these things are present for some of them, but not all of them. Family, friends, social networks, belief system featured very highly, unsurprisingly, because I was talking to a lot of refugees who'd come from particular backgrounds. But also routines and rituals became very, very significant. Involvement in community and quite often supportive mentors, but not always. But what was lacking for them was all of the other things. They were surrounded by religious intolerance a lot of the time. It's really problematic for them, and racial intolerance. They didn't have stable and adequate income or good ways of managing their finances. They certainly didn't have stable residences. These are students who don't necessarily live in halls because halls are very expensive, and they will often be shifting around the community, moving often and living in the worst accommodation. Unsurprisingly, because of their backgrounds, they often have difficulties with mental and physical health, but won't necessarily access resources that can support them. They struggle to be accepted by their peers. They have social networks, but not the sorts of social networks that will actually embed them in the university. Most of their social networks are outside of the university. They struggle with feelings of mattering, and they often have issues around family cohesion, etc., etc. And two of the things that I think are fundamentally important, and why higher education needs to think much more carefully about the ways in which students are supported to become resilient, is they lack family capital in all sorts of forms, and they often lack, because of that, access to educational capital, so that's not there for them either. So those are the two fundamental things that they were lacking that I think higher education could actually provide for them. So the sorts of students that were dropping out, I've talked about a couple of them earlier on, but these are very typical across the narrative. So forced migrants who suffer from stress, loneliness, isolation, former refugee, lack of peer acceptance, somebody who's been through prison, lack of family capital and educational capital, and we can go on. So this is a single person on a very low income, mental health and stress in the family, insecure housing, care leaver, lack of access to educational capital, former refugee, with all sorts of different mental health concerns, etc. So they have both been extraordinarily resilient people, able to draw on a range of internal resources, but it just becomes too much of them in higher education. The place is not a place of safety and security for them, but actually a place of risk and insecurity.